Hey everyone, so today I wanted to talk about the reenactment kit I actually have on the moment to some extent, which is this, one of my newest replicas, which is a replica of the Coppergate Helmet, which is an Anglo-Saxon, Dark Age, early medieval, late antique, whatever phrase you want to use for the period, but it is an early Anglo-Saxon style helmet. The original was much more decorative with, bronze decoration and even an inscribed prayer, whereas this one is quite plain, but we know from other archaeological examples, such as the Pioneer Helmet, or carvings on Pictish stones that seem to show this general style of helmet, that not all of them were quite as decorated as the Coppergate helmet proper, so I'm not too bothered by how plain this is, although I would like to add some decoration at some point. But rather than actually talking about either this specific helmet or any of the specific historical examples that I referenced before, I want to talk about a specific feature of both this helmet and the originals, which is they're quite thin. My replica here is 1 millimeter thick throughout most of it. At a few places it is thicker, so it's about 2 millimeters at certain points around the nose, which I think is quite nice, because it's something it could quite break my nose if it started bending back. And this is something that is a surprising fact for a lot of people when you look at early helmets, early medieval, late antique helmets, is that they are quite thin. A fairly recent paper, which was largely about a specific Anglo-Saxon or perhaps Anglo-Scandinavian might be a better term for it. A helmet that was found in Britain, but seems to be of Scandinavian origin during the Viking Age. This one here was a paper about it came out. Basically, the gist of it is, for a while it was thought this helmet was a fake, and these new investigations into their metallurgy suggest that no, this is authentic helmet, something from the period, not a forgery. And that's quite interesting on its own. But what I want to focus on specifically is it talks about how one of the reasons why people thought this might be a forgery was that the helmet was so thin, and that they were used to thicker helmets from the later Middle Ages, which again are thicker. So compared to that, this early medieval helmet seemed too thin, something just made out of sheet metal, to look like a helmet more than what they expected of an authentic medieval helmet. And this author says, now looking back, that we have more excavations and more knowledge about early medieval helmets, that no, really an early medieval helmet tends to only be between 1 and 2 millimeters thick, as opposed to these thicker later medieval and high medieval helmet examples. In this paper, the author suggests that this is because of the size of armies, that in the high medieval and late medieval periods you have these larger armies where they were fighting sort of in dense formations, whereas in the early Middle Ages he said their armies were much smaller, sometimes even just dozens of men, so they would have fought instead of in tight, compact formations with large infantry blocks or what have you, in a looser formation in a more skirmishing style. And I disagree with this on a few points. One is I think he's exaggerating the size difference between the early medieval armies and high and late medieval armies. It is true to say that that early medieval armies were smaller, but I think this thing that we hear quite often, actually, that they were dozens of men rather than hundreds, is I think not particularly true. I think armies were larger than we might expect based off of hearing this, and that this skirmishing style might not have been sort of as prevalent as we might expect based off of that, I think, slightly false or misinterpreted information, rather. But I do think that talking about why that is the size of arms is something that deserves its own video. So at one point in the future, I'll make that video. For now, I'm going to focus on something he doesn't mention, but I think is a better explanation for why helmets were thinner, which is weaponry. So in the early Middle Ages, something that I've mentioned quite a few times, our most common weapon is a one-handed thrusting spear. And for that, I'll grab this. This is another new piece of kit for me, a small one-handed thrusting spear. And this is quite small. The head is, less than my stretched out hand. And this is actually not quite uncommon. This would, of course, depend on, when exactly you're saying for how we're counting the early Middle Ages, because that's still a term of centuries and of a wide geographic area. So this works quite well with my sort of Celtic kit, early medieval Irish or early medieval picks. But you might get, it might be on the smaller side, but not inauthentic for other groups of people during the time period. But, this is the weapon for most of the early Middle Ages, is this one-handed thrusting spear. And, we might call it a polearm in that it is a weapon, an arm, that is on a pole, but it's quite different from how we might imagine later polearms, the true, high medieval cavalry lances, the pole axes, halberds, that sort of things. For one, it's, as I mentioned, it's a lot smaller, both in terms of the head, which I pointed out, but even the shaft. By looking at the internal diameter of the collar of spears and even the butts of spears, things don't really get that much longer or that much bigger than, say, an inch diameter. They could get sometimes quite smaller. For instance, the internal diameters of the spears from the Sutton Hoo ship burial were only about between an inch and 3/4 of an inch. This particular spear I'm holding at the moment is 3/4 of an inch diameter shaft, by the way. And again, they're used one-handed to thrust with, based off of most of the pictorial evidence. Occasionally you have two-handed spears, but it seems to be a spear being used in two hands rather than a spear designed to be used in two hands, if that makes sense. They'll still be shown with a shield thrown on their back or something. They're clearly not using this in two hands in the same way that a later medieval knight or somebody might expect to use only two-handed weapon. This is sort of a thing you can do with a spear more than something you were expected to do with a spear, if that logic makes sense. Pole arms, like we think of them, even one-handed weapons, could get quite smaller and lighter than we expect. So for instance, for large parts of the world, particularly sort of Britain and Ireland, where I tend to focus, battle axes weren't particularly common. They weren't unheard of, although there's actually not really any evidence for the use of battle axes prior to the Vikings in Ireland, although there's occasional archaeological finds of things that appear to be battle axes in Anglo-Saxon England, and a few references in Welsh heroic poetry. So they don't seem to be common, but they did exist. Really, they became common in the Viking Age. Swords could get quite powerful. We might be used to swords like this when we talk about the Dark Age swords, in that it's fairly long and broad and relatively untapered. This does have a slight taper, so it's not parallel bladed as well, there are examples of things that have parallel edges, although in those cases it would still have sort of a taper in thickness. But they weren't all like this. So for instance, this sword, which is shorter and thinner and still tapered, would also fit pretty well in most armies. This would work, I mean, again, best in the cultures that do have more diminutive weapons, things like the Picts and Ireland. But, even Anglo-Saxon swords do have big ones and small ones. So, we might think of not all swords as those big parallel-sided meaty choppers. They could get quite diminutive. So I think that when we look at the weaponry available to late antique and early medieval warriors, you just simply didn't need that level of protection. So when we start moving into the High Middle Ages, and we do get thicker helmets, we get bigger weapons. We get what we might consider a proper polearm, halberds and large lances, as well as sort of even the one-handed weapons get more meatier, more percussive, we might say. Things like more battle axes, heavier battle axes, a rise of maces, although those do still appear in certain parts of the world in the early medieval period, although they become a lot more common. And then at the end of the Viking period, of course, you have the big two-handed Dane axes, which we might consider the proto polearm, that you're moving away from just a spear towards these other sort of late and high medieval proper polearms, we might say. And I think that's a better explanation as to why helmets of the early Middle Ages and of late antiquity seem to be thinner than helmets in later phases of the Middle Ages. Is this not to do with the fighting style and that it was looser skirmish formations, but it had to do with the other weaponry that was being used, that a thinner helmet could do a good enough job protecting you against the armament that it would be facing in the day, and that when you get those thicker helmets of the high and late Middle Ages, they're protecting you against weapons that might be packing more of a punch, things like the polearms. So that's pretty much all I really had to say. I'd love to read your comments on this. So this is a bit of an interesting topic, I think. But yes, that's my theory, is that it has more to do with weapons than with sort of fighting style and tactics. Also, before I go, I'd like to say that recently, earlier in the week, I was on a Irish history podcast with my friend Philip Hayes, who I went to college with for a bit. And I'll put a link to that down below, and we talk about early medieval Irish warbands. And if you find my channel quite interesting, I imagine you'll enjoy his channel, and of course I recommend you listen to the episode I was on. So I'll leave that down in the description, and thank you for watching.